Hello guys, welcome back to this channel and thanks for viewing this video. Today we are going to talk about the grid bag layout. In the previous video we talked about layout managers, the grid layout, border layout, box layout. Today it's high time for us to talk about the grid bag layout. So the grid bag layout manager is a very sophisticated and flexible layout manager. And what it does is that it aligns your GUI components by placing them within a grid of cells. And it also allows your GUI components to span more than one cell. So the rows in the grid can have different heights, and the grid columns can have different width as well. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to use this particular grid layout and how to set it to your frame. And we are also going to take a look at various methods that you can use on this layout manager. So my project is organized this way. I'm going to be using two classes. I have my main class here in which I'm having my main method. And I also have another class that I called GridBagLayout demo. So this class is going to extend, or it's going to inherit the properties of the JFrame class. So this is going to make sure that an element or the object of this class would actually be a frame, because it's going to extend the properties of the JFrame, and the JFrame class is used for creating frames. And that's it. I'm going to come back to the main class here. We'll write only one line of code when we would want to create our frame object. But let me come back to our GridBagLayout demo class. So once we have done that, we can now create our constructor. So the GridBagLayout demo constructor would look like this. So I will say public GridBagLayout demo, open and close the brackets, and I will open the curly braces like this. Okay, so now I can actually define the various variables or the various elements for this particular frame. So the first thing I'm going to say, I'm going to declare a variable of type container, and I'm going to call it pane, and I will say equal to get content pane method. So like this. So I need to import the container class. So this particular line of code is going to help us to get access to the content pane. And as you know, the content pane of the frame is the inner area of the frame. So that's the area where your GUI components are. It's the area below the title bar. All right. So after we have done that, we can now set the layout manager. So we will simply say pane that set layout. And in here, we will say new grid bag layout. I need to import the GridBagLayout class. So GridBag. Now I have imported the GridBagLayout. So this line of code is going to make sure that the layout manager for our frame or for the pane is going to be the GridBagLayout. Next, I need to have another object that is going to be called constraint. So these constraints are actually going to define some properties of the elements that I would add to my frame. And I'm going to explain that to you in a couple of minutes. So I'll simply say grid bag constraint, and I will call this constraint is equal to new grid bag constraint. So I need to import the grid bag constraints class. So this is going to be an object that will define the constraints of our GUI elements. So I'm also going to define some static variables. So I will say final boolean, and the first one I will say should fill equal true. I will say final boolean again, should weight x be true, and final boolean, I'll call this right to left, and for this I'll say false. So now we are going to use these static variables that we have created. So we are going to make sure that the component that we would add to our frame are wide enough to fill its display area horizontally without changing its height. So what we are going to do is we will say if the static variable should fill, okay, because it's a Boolean variable, open the curly braces. Now I'm going to determine or define a constraint. So I will say constraint because that's the constraint object we created up here. And I will use a class called fill equal to GridBag constraint that horizontal and then semicolon. So as I said, so this line of code is actually going to make sure that the component that we would add to our frame is wide enough and it's able to fill its display area horizontally, because we have said horizontal here, without changing the height of that particular GUI component. So now let's create a button. So we will say J button, I'll say button, go to new J button. I will set the text of this button to button 1. I need to import the J button class. So we have declared a button here. So now we have to determine how to distribute space among various columns. So here we will say if I will use the other static variable. So that's should weight x. And in here, I'm going to add a constraint. So I will say constraint. So constraint is the name of the constraint object we declared here. And we will use a class called weight x is equal to 0.5. So as you know, this if statement is going to actually make sure that we are determining how to distribute the column space between the various elements that will be added to our frame. That we are going to add the first component to the frame or to the pane. So the first component is the J button that we declared here. We are going to add it to the frame. But before we add it to the frame, we are going to add another constraint. So we will say constraint that fill grid bag constraint that horizontal. And next we need to specify the row and column at the upper left of the component. So if you want to specify the row and column, so these are going to be constraints as well. So we will say constraint that grid x is equal to 0. And then another constraint that grid y would also be equal to 0. Now we can add the button to our pane. So we will say pane that add, and we call this button. And now if you want to make sure that the constraint is actually going to take effect, or that you want to apply the constraints that you just defined here to this particular button that you're adding on frame, you need to add another argument here and say constraint. So the argument is going to be the constraint object, so that all these methods, all these constraints that you added would apply to this particular button. Now, if we want to run and we want to see the frame, we actually need to set some attributes to our frame. So we will come here and say this, that set size 800 for the width and 600 for the height. We can say this, that set title. This could be, I'll simply say GridBag Layout demo. We can also add this, that set location relative to, in the brackets, null. And down here, I will say this, that set visible true. Now let's come to our main class. If we want to actually create an object of type GridBagLayout demo, so we will simply say GridBagLayout demo. We simply say frame, okay, and new GridBagLayout demo, and then semicolon. So let's see what will happen if we run this. Now when we run, you can see we are having a frame and then we're having a very large button. So let's come back to our grid layout demo. Now we want to add a second component to our frame. So this component would still be a button. So I would say button 2, new J button, and the text would be button 2. Of course, I need to add a semicolon here. I'm going to add some constraints as well. So what I'm going to do, I will simply copy these constraints here, and I'm going to change them. Okay, so I will leave this fill constraint the same I'm going to add another constraint that I'm going to call constraint weight x equal to 0.5. So as you know, this constraint weight x is actually used to distribute the space among columns. And then the other constraints, like the grid bag constraints horizontal, is actually there to make sure that the component is wide enough to fill its display area horizontally without changing the height of the component. And as for the constraint that grid X and constraint that grid Y, they are there to specify the row and column at the upper left of the component. So because we say that it's 0 for the grid X and 0 for the grid Y, so what will happen if we actually change these? Let's say, for example, we want to give it the value of 1 here. We leave this to 0.5 and leave this to 0. So the next thing we need to do is to add this second button to our pane. So we say pane that add button, and we are also going to add the constraint. So we say constraint here. So it's really important to actually add the constraint, because if you don't add the constraints, you're going to have a different result. So now you can see two buttons showing at different positions, button 1, button 2. So just like I was saying, if you remove the constraint here, let's see what would happen. Now you can see what would happen. Button 2 would have a different size than 1. So it's important to add a constraint. And one other thing I wanted to show you is that what if we said that instead of adding these components to the frame as we did like this, but we would rather say that we would remove this out here and then paste it down below here. What would happen? If you run, you see now only button 1 would show, but button 2 would not show. So that said, if, for example, I want to add a third button to my frame, what should I do? I'm going to copy this, for example, and then paste it. I will simply change some constraints here. So let me say this is button 3 and here is button 3. I would leave this to constraint horizontal, and then I will also leave this to 0.5, but the grid X would be 2 here because I want this particular button to show next to button 2. Okay, so as you can see, grid X here is 0, here is 1. So that means that button 2 would actually show next to button 1. You will see that if I say 0 here and then run, now only button 1 and button 2 are showing. Okay, but if I say 1 like this, okay, what did I do here? So if I say I say 0 here and change this to button 3 and run, so only button 1 and button 3 are showing because button 2 is actually overlapped by button 1 because they are having the same grid X position. Okay, but if I say 1 here and leave it like this, grid X for button 3 is 2, you will see that I'm going to have 3 buttons. So this is at position grid X 0, position grid X 1, and this is grid X 2. Okay, for the grid Y, okay, it's still at position 0. What if I say that for this one, I want its grid Y to be equal to 1 for button 2 and run? Now you can see that button 2 has been pushed down. Okay, so the grid X, grid Y, they are actually determining the positioning of the button. And for the weight X, it's actually about the column spacing. All right, so I will take back to 0 like this. So I will add a 4th button. So I will say copy, paste it, and I will simply change here. Instead of button 3, I will say button 4, and then here would be button 4 as well. I will leave this constraint horizontal. As for the weight X, I would say 0.0. For the grid X constraint, I will say 1 and leave this to 0. Now let's add button 4 and then the constraints. So now let's run. So you see that the button 4 will not show because we say that the grid X is 1. the same as for button 1. So let's say that we want to actually change the width of this particular button 4. So we will say constraint that grid width that will be equal to 3. Now we are gonna make this particular button 4 tall. So we will say constraint that ipad y is equal to 40. So as I said, this is gonna make this particular button 4 tall. And let me run. Now you can see that button 4 is actually overlapping over button 3 and button 2 because we say that it has to be tall. All right, so let's add another button. So this one will be called button 5, like this. So I'll say button 5 here. So as for the fill, I'll leave this to horizontal. I would also remove all of this, okay? I would add some other constraints. So let's say, for example, that I want to reset the constraint to default. But before I do that, the one thing I want to explain to you, the reason why we are adding constraints for each button is because if we don't add the constraints for the next buttons, it is going to take the constraint for the previous button. Let's say, for example, we didn't add any constraint for button 4. So automatically, button 4 would actually apply the constraint of button 3. So the same thing, if we didn't add any constraint for button 2, 3, and 4, but only added a constraint for button 1, automatically all these buttons down here would take the constraint of button 1, the first button we declared here. So when we declare the constraint for all the buttons, is a way for us to actually override the constraints that were set for the previous button. So that's basically it. So now here for button 5, if you want to reset the constraint to default, we're gonna do this. We can actually say constraint that ipad y. So this is for the height, that will be 0, semicolon. If we run, we have to actually add button 5 here. So let me just comment this and then run. So we will uncomment this. We can actually request any extra vertical space. So that will be constraint that weight y be 1.0, and we can add some bottom space. So we say constraint that anchor grid bag constraint that page underscore end. We want to add, you can also add some padding. Okay, we will say constraint that insets equal new insets. So this is going to be for the top padding, for the left, bottom, and right. So I need to import the insets class. So let's say that, what if we want to align this particular button with our button 2? So we know that button 2 grid x is equal to 1. So we would simply say constraint that grid x is equal to 1, semicolon. And we want our button to be 2 columns wide. So that would be constraint that grid width is equal to 2. So it's going to be 2 columns wide. As you can see, button 4 is 3 columns wide. If I run now, you can see that button 4 is actually very large because the width, as we defined it, to be 3 here. But for button 5, we are saying that it's going to be 2 columns wide. We can also say that we want our particular button 5 to show at the 3rd row. So it's going to be constraint that grid y equal to 2, like this. Okay, so now let's run and see what will happen. So now, as you can see, button 5 is showing down here because we said page end here. What if we remove, we comment this and run? Now we can see where our button 5 is showing. So guys, that's actually how you can play around the grid bag layout and all the various constraints and objects and methods you can use to really place your components on a pane or on a frame. I hope this video was informative, and please don't forget to like, to share, to comment if you have any contribution or question. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more videos like this one. Let's meet in the next one.